America has never been at rest. Born amid revolution, driven by a novel vision of self-government and always testing our limits. From defending freedom at home and abroad to contests of strength and skill, we seek and celebrate excellence. Ours is a history of facing social challenges, righting wrongs, and sharing prosperity to lift others. In a uniquely American way, we even challenge our own ideas through freedom of thought, speech, and representation. Some claim the American experiment is failing, but the principles of freedom have already proven successful. We see all around us people, when allowed to exercise their God-given rights, have unlimited capacity. The experiment today is about us. The test is, will we hold to the principles that have made us free? Today's social media and headlines show how quickly a disagreement can become a point of contempt. Public discourse devolves into partisan division, even violence. And every election is treated as if it's the last chance. This makes promising ideas difficult to debate, and sound public policy almost impossible to achieve. It limits the marketplace of ideas. It threatens our founding principles and the institutions necessary for those principles to work. Most people are beyond tired of the fear and anger. They are exhausted. But recognizing the problem means we can change course. The solution is not to meet contempt with contempt or division with more division, nor is it in the tearing down of the formative institutions which foster freedom. The solution is to recommit to our founding principles, reinvigorate our civic institutions, and equip the next generation with the knowledge and understanding to address the challenges of today and tomorrow. Applying this hopeful and principled approach to political conflict and sound policy is today's American experiment. The mission of Sutherland Institute is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society for those principles to endure. From research that informs, to events that empower, to ideas that inspire. We serve and unite a majority of Americans who believe in the transcendent value of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Together, we can inspire this generation's new birth of freedom.
Thank you, Sutherland, for starting us off on that note. My name is Morgan Lyon-Cotty. I'm the Associate Director of the Hinckley Institute, and I am here to welcome you all. In addition to providing students with transformative experiences, internships, one of the things Hinckley is very much known for, a core part of our mission is providing forums like this to inform, to make sure we have a citizenry that knows about politics and policy. And we're very grateful for Sutherland for being a partner, helping us do this over the years. And today we're excited to hear from Congressman Chris Stewart as part of the 2023 Congressional series. So we are going to start with Representative Stewart, who served in the 2nd District since 2013. He will be ending his time in Congress soon, and we're excited to hear about his reflections, what he thinks is going to be happening next. And so Congressman Stewart will start us with Rick Larson, the president and CEO of Sutherland Institute. And then following that conversation, we'll move to a moderated panel with Professor Jim Curry from the University of Utah, Christine Cook Fairbanks, who is Sutherland's Education Policy Fellow. And I feel like I'm forgetting someone. Is that our panel? That sounds like a very wonderful panel. I know who I'm forgetting. Our moderator, Nick Dunn, the Vice President of Strategy and Communications at Sutherland Institute. So with that, I will turn the time to Rick and to Congressman Stewart. Thank you for joining us.
We'll get perched on our stools. Good to be with you, Rick. Thank you.
Good to be with you. It's not lost on me. We won't get to do this again in this context. So
Yeah, probably not.
Thank you very much.
Faith, family, freedom, opportunity, responsibility, right?
Not a bad list.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
It should be helpful. There's a lot to talk about. Can we jump right in?
Sure.
So 5 terms in the United States
Yeah.
House of Representatives.
5.5.
5.5.
Yeah.
5.5. Just applause.
Are you clapping because they're glad I'm leaving? Is that what it is?
Oh, we will assume that was out of respect. I want to start at the highest level, and then we'll get down to some specific things you've done and some specific advice you would offer. But let's start first talking about Congress.
Yeah.
You've seen a lot of things in this period of time. I'm wondering if you've seen changes. How has the body changed? How has debate changed?
Yeah, so I've actually thought about this a little bit, and it occurred to me really early that things were different, and then they've gone, at a much faster pace, even more and more different now. So when I decided to run for Congress, I had never been involved with politics. I'd been a military officer, I'd been a small businessman, I was mostly a writer at the time. And some of my family had been in politics, but they'd worked on staff and other things. None of them were elected. So when I decided to run, I had no idea what I was doing. But a good friend of our family, Jim Hansen, who some of you will remember, he was a previous congressman from not the 2nd district, because the districts have changed, but generally from a lot of my district. I called him, and he and another former governor, Norm Bangerter, endorsed me, and they were, again, friends and very helpful. And I kept in contact with both of them until they passed away. But when I was first elected, I didn't have a kind of a support group around me. I hadn't, as I said, been in politics, so I didn't know a lot of people who had been, and so there are a few people that I could talk to who I thought could help me, and those that were those people, I relied a lot on them. So I would call Jim, and I would say, hey, Jim, this is going on, and this is happening, and the speaker is doing this, and the Democrats are doing this, and I would try to talk through, and see what he thought. And as we discussed, he would give me his advice, and after about the 2nd or 3rd phone call, I realized nothing he tells me makes any sense. And the reason is Congress was so different than when he was in Congress, and it had only been like 10 years. But he would tell me things, and it just didn't make any sense at all, or it just wasn't even a possible option. And in the intervening time, in 2010, the Freedom Caucus was formed, and they became a very powerful voice in Congress. And then you had, different groups on the progressive side who were, doing much the same thing, creating these, coalescing around these different causes. And bottom line of this is it changed a lot from Jim Hansen's experience, which, as I said, 8 or 10 years before me, and it's changed as much or more in the 10 years that I've been there. The worst job in the universe is to be a Republican Speaker of the House. And I really mean that. I mean, there's no way in the world I would ever take that job. You look at John Boehner. He was what they called a young gun. He was one of these guys who came to Congress as a radical, as kind of the Freedom Caucus guy. And in my view, and John Boehner is a good friend of mine, and I think he's a really decent person and a very conservative leader, but he left that job diminished. Paul Ryan. When I was first running, people would ask me, what do you want to do if you're elected? And I said, because the reason I was running at the time, that one of the primary issues at that time, 2012, was our debt and our spending. And so they'd say, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to go into Paul Ryan's office and shake his hand and say, I'm with you, brother. I want to help. I want to be in this fight. Because Paul's fight was debt and spending. And yet Paul, and he was very, very well respected. In fact, he was kind of compelled to be the speaker. He genuinely didn't want the job. He was smart enough not to want it. But Paul left there diminished. Kevin McCarthy, good friend of mine, I worry that he'll leave there diminished. It's just an impossible job. And I think that's a good indicator of how it has changed. It's been fractured. You have voices on both extremes that have become very influential. They're not in the majority, but they still have enormous influence. And I'm afraid that's just the day we live in. It's a very, very divisive time. I was talking with Gary, my district director, as we were driving up, we were talking about the upcoming election, and it worries me a lot what happens in our nation in the next 18 months in these very divided times.
I'd like your reaction to a concept. Those in the think tank world are constantly studying, assessing, defining these trends. And there's a definition that has evolved out of some good friends at American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. I'd love your reaction to this. There are those who say that Congress has shifted from a formative institution where its members aspired to behave to earn the respect that a member of Congress should have, that it has shifted to a performative platform, which implies people are running for office who may or may not fully understand the job, but seek it to perform, to further an agenda. Does that ring true with you?
Yeah, it certainly rings true. The thing that I don't know if whether it's more true now than it used to be. I mean, I can't go back 100 years ago, because there were some people who were, very public, very radical, who, some of our founding fathers you could describe that way. Do I think it's worse? Well, in my experience, it certainly is. Is it the worst it's ever been? Hard for me to say. I'm not a historian, and it's hard for someone, I think, to measure that. It's a very subjective measurement. But a couple things implied in the question, or in the question, that I think are worth addressing. You said they come to Congress and don't really know what they're doing. Well, that's true of everyone. There's no one who comes to Congress and understands the job. Some understand it better than others. There are some people, and I won't tell you who it is, although if you guys were Imagine, I think you could figure out and narrow it down to a couple people. But there's a guy, and he's actually a really decent person. I really quite like him. He was, not the first person I reached out to when he came to Congress. He's been there like 6 years or something. But he's very, very public. He's on the media all the time, and he says a lot of things that are actually just kind of silly. They're not very thoughtful, but in my opinion. But I was talking to him, and I said, we were talking, you're actually in the green room at Fox, and we were talking about being on media. And he said to me, this is the reason I'm here. He said, my sister was a producer for Fox, and she kind of helped me get started. He says, this is the reason I'm here. I'm a voice. I'm a message. I'm not here to, be really deep into the weeds on legislation. I'm here to talk on media. So, do I think that's the role of a member of Congress? Well, it's part of it, but it's not the thing and not the reason we should be there, I don't think. But for some people it is, and I think that's, to use your word, performative. But I really believe those people have a role, but to really be an effective member of Congress, you've got to be willing to work on legislation. You've got to be willing to make friends, including friends who you don't agree with. Because the only way you move something through Congress is to have friends on the other side of the aisle who will support you. It's much more than just public speaking or being on the media or trying to raise money by saying something crazy. I mean, I could be on the media virtually 8 hours a day if I would do one thing: be a Republican who criticizes Republicans. If you're willing to do that, they'll give you a huge platform. I could raise a lot of money doing that, but I don't think that's an effective member of Congress if that's the only thing you're doing.
We've seen some interesting media moments out of the House in particular. You think of the speaker vote and a few things that have gone on, division within the party. I think most people would like to know and possibly be reassured or alarmed by the answer, but is it any different when the cameras are off and the doors are closed among members of Congress? Is the relationship better than it appears?
Yeah, it is. And I almost hate to admit that because it shows you that there's not a lot of honesty in our public discourse. But the Appropriations Committee is a really good example of that. Very powerful committee, goes back, to the original Congress or nearly. So it's one of the original committees, and its responsibility is every dollar that's spent in the federal government has to go through the Appropriations Committee. So we touch every sector of government. There's not a piece of government that we don't have influence on and ultimately say whether we're going to fund it or not. Point being, it's a powerful historical committee. If you were to come to our markups, these are the 12 bills where we sit in a room much like this with the 60 members, and these markups may take 8 hours, they may take 18. But at the end of that session, this is after hundreds and hundreds of hearings, we now have to mark up the bill. If you were to listen to that debate, those 12 hours or 14 hours, you would think that we're ready to go to war with one another. because it's very partisan. This is the opportunity primarily for the member, or for the minority. And remember, I was in the minority just a few years ago, so I know what this is like. It's the one opportunity for us to get up and say, this is what we think and this is what we want to do. And it comes across as very partisan. For a nonpartisan committee, for a committee that is viewed as being less partisan than many of the others. But then when we walk out, you really do say, hey, John, how you doing? And there is, it doesn't translate into the personal relationships because there is more friendliness. And part of that is a lot of people feel like you just got to be decent with people, even if you think they're crazy, even if you think that what they're doing is just fundamentally wrong. But part of it is that some of it is, to use your previous question, kind of performative. This is my chance to talk to my constituents and say how bad Republicans are. Or this is my chance to say how bad the Democrats are. But they really don't believe it. In fact, I made that point once. I said, you guys say things that you really don't believe. You really don't think that Republicans hate all women. Or you really don't believe that Republicans are racist. I mean, they really don't. Maybe one or two of them. But I mean, if you listen to them, that's what you would think that they all thought. And I think that's probably a good example of what you see is not always what you get.
Well, let's follow up on that because the public, it's interesting to gauge public opinion and perception, and people are concerned. They, in fairly large numbers, view Congress as dysfunctional.
That's right.
What are they viewing it correctly? Is there a path to improvement?
Yeah.
What should the average voter do rather than wring their hands watching the evening news? What should they be doing?
So, I mean, what you do, and everyone hates this answer, but it's the answer. You get involved, you vote for people that you support, you vote for school board members that you support, you vote for governors, and you vote for congressmen and senators. I mean, at the end of the day, Congress reflects America. And that's an unfortunate fact and uncomfortable, but it's true, especially the House. Because every 2 years, I have to sit in a room with people like this and convince the majority plus one, or half of them plus one, to vote for me. And there's an enormous difference between the House and the Senate than the fact that we are up for re-election every 2 years. Some people have suggested to me, maybe we should make it every 4 years. That way you're not campaigning all the time. I'm like, nope, absolutely not. We need to be in touch with the people, and the only way you do that is if you compel us to go before the voters every 2 years and make that case. What was the question? I got diverted there for just a minute.
Well, I'm just curious what you would say to a public observing a Congress that they have decided is dysfunctional, but they don't feel like they have any power to correct it.
Yeah, so two things I want to say on that. Number one is it's really pretty simple, but it seems simplistic and like not very effective, but you got to vote for and support good people. But the other thing is our founding fathers intended for this to be chaotic. Freedom is difficult. They wanted it to be slow. They didn't want us to lurch from one policy to another in dramatic changes based on one election. And I'll give you a really good example of that. One of the things I'm most proud that we did was create the National Suicide Hotline number, the 988 number. This was a bill that literally will save millions of lives. It's already, by one study by USA Today, has saved well over 180,000 lives. It hasn't even been implemented for a year. Didn't cost a lot of money, not partisan. Who's not for suicide prevention, right? We had hundreds of Democrats co-sponsor that. Still took me 5 years to move that through Congress and through the FEC. Our founding fathers wanted that to be that way. They wanted it to be thoughtful and deliberate, and that's in the House. The Senate's even more so. But that frustrates a lot of people, and so their presumption is sometimes, well, Congress is slow, therefore it's dysfunctional. Not always. Sometimes that slowness is actually the function of Congress. It's the way our founding fathers intended it.
I think it's a very important point, especially, you can have extremes within, you can have older generations longing for a day when things were better, whether they really were or not. The memory says they were better. And then you've got a younger generation who, quite understandably, doesn't know what to think when they watch how things are working. But the call is for engagement, right? It's to become part of the process.
Yeah. And I would make two observations on that if I could. Number one is, if you want to see partisan, really bitter partisan rhetoric, look at what things were said about Abraham Lincoln. And when I say things are said about him, I'm not talking about from Southern leaders. I'm talking about his own friends in many cases. And the partisanship and the bitterness rhetoric of politics is not new to us. It's clearly been with us again since the founding fathers. But the thing that worries me a little bit is that a lot of that rhetoric was centered in politics and among politicians. I don't feel like Americans felt a lot of that. You know, I don't think in the 1870s someone asked, are you a Republican or Democrat? Nearly so much. It worries me now that it's much more in our society. It's much more beyond just the body politic. And even to the point where some people appear to be self-sorting as you see people leave certain states and move to other states. And you know, the polling that shows that I wouldn't be friends with someone who was a Democrat because I'm Republican, that worries me a lot. I think that is new. That didn't used to be the case. Not in my lifetime, for sure. Even in very divided times, that's something that's different in our society now.
I agree with that observation, and it doesn't trend well if you think about where that's going. Let's talk about, you touched on an accomplishment, and you've had many over a long career in public service. What jumps out, what would you highlight as maybe the 3 or 4 things you are most proud of in addition to the suicide prevention line?
You know, I should give that some thought because people are going to ask me. Obviously, one of the things I'm very proud of is the work we did on the Intelligence Committee. It's a very important committee. It's a select committee, so it's very small. And the members on it are really the most extraordinary members of Congress. But the problem is on that, you can't talk about much of the work we do. So hard to come home and brag. But I remember, as an example, when we were, you know, really more involved with the Middle East and Syria particularly. I remember being there. Now, I wasn't in Syria because a member of Congress could not go to Syria. But we were there in the region and very, very close. And I remember it was a program that no American had any idea about. It was an expensive program, $1 billion a year. So it wasn't a small program. And my job was to go there and decide, are we going to continue to fund this? Are we getting our money's worth? Is this the outcome we're hoping for? And I actually felt tremendous responsibility, not just to the $1 billion. I mean, $1 billion in today's world, I mean, that's pocket change, right? But it was more to the fact that what direction we went was going to impact lives, and it was people were going to die regardless. And if we didn't get the right decision, many more people were going to die. So that kind of work is something I'm very proud of as well. And then finally, you know, it's been 50 years since Utah's had a member on the Appropriations Committee, and we desperately need that presence. And so the ability to fund priorities, including priorities here, that I think, look, the federal government's going to spend money. Let us decide how it's spent. I'm not advocating for spending more money. I'm advocating for let us decide how the money is spent in a way that makes sense. I think I'm very, very proud of that. And then finally, this is kind of a surprising one. On my wall, I don't have all the legislation we've sponsored, but we've got plaques for like maybe 12 or 14 of the most important. One of them is one that says rejected. And it was a bill that I thought, this makes no sense at all. We should do everything we can to stop this. And a bill that we thought was probably almost certainly going to pass, we were able to stop. And I thought, that's good. Sometimes it's not just pushing good ideas. Sometimes it's stopping really bad ideas.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm watching the clock. Am I okay on time for those? Okay. I want to make, you've made a decision recently, which is leading to the conclusion of this phase of your career, and it's a decision that had everything to do with family. I mentioned Congress as a formative institution, but I don't want to let time run out without giving you the chance to talk about family as a formative institution in this nation. I know you're involved with the Respect for Marriage Act. A lot of these things become partisan in implementation, but at the core of that, there were principles that had everything to do with the family as a formative institution in our country.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about how you see that going forward and the opportunity for families to actually form the future citizens and those attitudes that will keep us free.
Yeah. Faith, family, freedom.
Right.
Opportunity, responsibility.
Yeah.
All of them together. Look, this will sound simplistic, And it shouldn't be controversial, but in some cases it is. But it shouldn't be. But I would argue, and I could, I think, effectively argue with facts and figures that show this one thing is really clear. The vast majority of the societal problems that we're experiencing right now can be traced back to the foundation of the family and the diminishing or the weakening of family in our society. And you pick a problem, not in every case, but in many of them, you can go back and see that that is the root cause of it. And you know, the thing that's sad about that, Rick, is the root cause, so we have problems, but you have to remember those problems create unhappiness and stress and disappointment in people's lives. It leads to people being less opportunity to be happy and living fulfilling lives. So protecting the family. And you know, as a military member, a guy who, you know, my family and I served for a long time in the Air Force and before we came to Congress, the support of the family for people who try to serve and how important that is. I mean, there's so many different reasons why the family is important. But if you care about society and if you care about our future, you have to care about the family and you have to try to support the family. We had a Congressional Achievement Awards thing in my office earlier this morning where these really bright couple of young women had won this award, and I was able to give them their award and their medal. And you look at the things they're accomplishing, and I asked them, what are you looking forward to? And as they're answering this question, you know, in your life, as they're answering this question, I think how important it is for us to protect our culture and our society and our government so that they can live happy lives that they expect and that they deserve. But there's so much to that. I mean, that's a question we could answer, we could talk about for hours.
One of the elements of the question that I find interesting is, it seems, I just sat in an interesting roundtable discussion this morning where the group around the table could have easily identified points of disagreement or common principles, and we immediately jumped to common principles. It was a very fruitful conversation. What advice would you give to the next congressman from your district or anyone aspiring to run for office? What have you learned about how to take the partisanship out of the debate and get to the principle? Or is that possible? Is that advisable?
Yeah. So good news and bad news on that, I think. I hate to give bad news. But you know, 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, we were arguing about important things, but we were arguing about what's the right corporate tax rate, or, you know, what's the right formula to determine, you know, welfare benefits, or, you know, a number of things, important things, not just about the economy, but about national security, you know, how much do we support NATO, et cetera. Important issues, but they weren't existential issues to us. And we're debating now principles and issues that define us entirely as a nation. And we weren't debating those in the same way before. I mean, we're really at a crossroads in many ways of deciding who we are and what we believe as people. And because that's true, they're very difficult to find common ground or to compromise on those things. For example, hey, if you want, I'll use it's a simple example. It's not the best, but it works. If you want to talk about the right corporate tax rate, I'm happy to compromise with you on that. But if you want to talk about what it means to be a man or a woman, or if you want to talk about what religious liberty, what liberties are you willing to give up in order to protect religious liberty? You know, those things are much, much more difficult to compromise on. And at some point you have to say there can be no compromise on this. If you actually feel like the outcome is to destroy who we are as a people or a culture. So the bad news is I think we're going to have divisive conversations about this as we've had for the last half generation. I don't see those being resolved by the weekend. We're probably going to have some difficult conversations about that. The good news is you can work your way through those. We have. The best example, obviously, the creating of our Constitution and the government, they were deciding these existential questions as well. And they found a way to compromise them. If you say compromise, here's a good example. How do you compromise on whether an African-American slave is a person or not, right? That's a hard thing to have a conversation about. But our founding fathers had to do that. And they found a way to do it. They didn't find the solution, but they found a way to get to the solution in the near future. Again, very emotional debate about that kind of an issue. Imagine the debate over the Civil War. And what we found a way to get, obviously in a horrible outcome, but we still came back together as a nation. So if anyone tells me that these issues are too tough, we can't find answers, I think that's nonsense. We've demonstrated as a country we can. But if anyone were to say to me they're going to be simple, I think that's equally nonsense. It's going to be difficult. We're seeing the difficulty of it. But I'm optimistic that we can, and we have to try. We owe it to those 2 young girls who were in my office this morning. We owe it to my kids and my grandkids. We owe it to them to do everything we can to have a positive outcome here. And I find too many people who are just kind of throwing up their hands, truly throwing up their hands and saying, you know, it's just too hard. We're not going to be able to fix this. That's not true. We can fix it.
Often our legacies are defined by those around us rather than anything we'd like to intentionally seek. And this is not a wake. This is an end of a portion of a career, and you'll yet do many important things. But as you look back on your time in the House of Representatives, what would you like to most be remembered for, and what do you take away from that experience that keeps you hopeful about the future of this nation?
What would I most like to be remembered for? So I did not want to leave Congress, and after 11 years, I was in a position where we had real influence, partly because of my seniority, partly because of my committees and the friendships and relationships I'd made. And I certainly didn't want to leave Congress in the middle of a term. But I think most people know my wife had a stroke about a year ago, and it's, you know, we tried to work through it for a year, and doctors said give it a year. But we reached a point where I realized it just wasn't fair to her any longer for me to be gone all the time. And in Congress, you're gone all the time, but then my responsibilities on intelligence, I mean, I was gone all the time. I mean, in just the last 6 months, I've been overseas many, many times. And I realized it wasn't fair to her. So very awkward, very difficult decision, but we had to announce I'm going to retire and I'm not going to finish out my term. I did not know how people would accept that. I expected kind of a worst case scenario. I had some people tell me, oh, you're going to be damaged goods, you know, no one's going to want to associate with you. I thought, well, maybe, I hope that's not true. But I have had hundreds of people reach out from around the country, and they all said the same thing. It's just getting to the answer. They all said, hey, you've been a great congressman, we're going to miss you, you know, things you would expect. But almost to the person, they said something that I didn't expect. They said, I want you to know I'm proud of you for making this decision. When we say we put family first, only a couple times in our lives is that tested. And that's the thing that I think I would like to be remembered for. Someone who said he loved his family, would put his family first, and when he had to, he did. That experience has been very gratifying to me. It's really kind of uplifted my faith and belief in people, that they would realize that I didn't do this for selfish purpose. I did it because your family sometimes has to be your priority. And I didn't anticipate that, but I think that's the one thing that I would like to be remembered for. Someone who believed, loved his country, loved his family, and put them as priority.
I would echo that, and having had interactions with you over the last several years, you have always demonstrated those principles, and this was a test. And
by the way, I think most people would do that. I don't think I'm exceptional in that way at all. Yeah. I would tell people all the time, you would do the same thing. Most people would do the same thing.
Yeah. Fill in the blank, and then we'll let you get off this stool. I am hopeful in the future of the United States because...
I think about that all the time. I know the answer, because God cares about this country. Whether we like it or not, and some people don't like it. Some people resent it, and it's not easy for us. But whether we like it or not, we are the glue that holds the world together. If the United States stumbles, the world crumbles underneath us. And that's true from an intelligence perspective, it's true from national security, it's true from trade, it's true from diplomacy, it's true from everything that matters. Everyone in the world looks to us for leadership, whether we like it or not. And God knows that, and God still cares about this country. We don't get to decide when it's the end of the country. We don't get to decide when it's the end of the world. God gets to decide that. And until he's decided that, we have a responsibility to work and to fight and to try to protect our country. And I'm hopeful because I still think the United States has an enormously important role in the world. And I wrote a book called 7 Miracles Saved America, premise of it being God cares about our country enough to provide miracles in our past. I think that's hopefully true of the future as well.
Beautiful. Good note to end on. Thank you for your service.
Appreciate the Sutherland and Hinckley, 2 great organizations. We're very proud to be associated with you, and keep working.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative and Rick, for that excellent conversation. The next portion of our event today is a policy panel discussion, so I'd like to invite our panelists to go ahead and come up here and join me. Jim, if you want to be there, and Christine on the end. One of the things we want to do with this portion is draw on many of the themes that Rick and the Congressman spoke about and see if we can apply that in a way that gives some policy specifics and a little bit more meat and depth to the idea of how Congress is in terms of health as an institution. So I'll briefly give introductions, and then I'd like for each of you to just give a quick snippet about your background, your bio, and kind of what brings you to this discussion today. So Jim Curry, professor here at U of U, and Christine Cook Fairbanks, our education policy fellow at Sutherland. But Jim, let's start with you. What about your background and your experience brings you to this discussion? And then same question for you, Christine.
Yeah, so I've been a professor of political science at the University of Utah for going on 12 years now. I'm an expert on Congress and national policy making. Before coming to Utah, I worked on Capitol Hill in various congressional offices, got my PhD at the University of Maryland. So I guess that's what brings me to be here today.
Yeah, I was a former public school teacher, English teacher, secondary ed, and went to law school and really pursued public policy and government offices, and have been working in think tank worlds for 7 or 8 years. So.
The reason I wanted to ask them both to do that is to give some context to what we're going to talk about now with what our first conversation was, how healthy is Congress as an institution? And an extension of that is how capable is it at actually moving the needle on policy issues that we care about. And with Christine's expertise, we'll dive a little bit into the issue of education. So to start things off, I want to ask just that broad general question. And Jim, let's start with you and then go to Christine. But how would you view the health of the institution of Congress today? If you were asked, give a quick diagnosis, how's it doing? Healthy, not healthy, productive, not productive, and especially through your lens kind of as the institution, and then Christine, for you maybe, in terms of its efficacy in actually enacting policy that helps Americans.
So I always give Congress a B. Maybe that makes me somewhat of a congressional optimist. I also don't give it an A because maybe this is a warning to potential students that I think it's hard to give an A because there's always room for improvement. I always give Congress a B, and it's because Congress has a really challenging and difficult job. Members of Congress have a really challenging and difficult job relative to public expectations. The public wants a Congress that carefully and closely deliberates over every issue, identifies the most pressing policy problems, and finds locked down solutions that solve these problems for good, and they'd like them to do that in an expedient manner like yesterday. This is impossible. What Congress does is, they spend a lot of time debating over the issues that matter to Americans. They do move legislation more than most people recognize. And they do give voice to a lot of different perspectives across what's a very big and diverse country with a lot of competing concerns. I think Congress does very well at those things. I think it does better than most legislatures in the world at those things. Now, of course, there's always things they could improve on. But as a whole, I think, despite the bad press that Congress gets, which it's gotten throughout its history, I think generally it's, does fairly well given the challenge presented before it.
So not as bad as it seems, to condense down maybe.
Never as bad as it seems, I would say.
Christine, from a policy lens, especially with your expertise in education policy, how is the health of the institution at actually delivering results in a way that voters would find beneficial?
When it comes to education, I think part of the answering this health is a misunderstanding of probably their role. From the people, sometimes the elected leaders, Congress is really not the right institution for education policy. The Constitution doesn't mention it, so it's not one of the enumerated powers. The 10th Amendment says anything that's not listed goes to the states. Right, so there's sort of this kind of legal, constitutional concern that people bring up. But even in practical ways, it's not the best institution, right? As has been mentioned before, it's kind of a slow-moving lawmaking body, and sometimes education needs bolder reforms or something that can be more nimble. And so it's not always the best option to look to Congress as kind of the institution for education.
Let's dive into that a little bit, because I think there's potentially two angles we could attack that with. Number one, what you're saying is essentially, hey, in the realm of education policy, Congress is not the right entity to begin with to make progress on this issue. And I want to kind of try and couple that with the question of polarization and gridlock, and is there a second reason that say, well, they're not even that good at getting anything done? That seems to be kind of the perception. So if we view it through that lens, the question I would ask is, because of that strong perception that Congress is incredibly polarized, there's, gridlock is as bad as it's ever been, that's the perception out there. Is that true, and is that also a good reason for why maybe education policy might be better served at the state level? So Jim, let's start with you on that kind of polarization and gridlock question. Either confirm that perception or set it straight. What's the truth as far as Congress getting stuff done?
So Congress is both polarized and probably less polarized than people recognize. There's a certain amount of performative polarization that the congressman was referring to, but then there's a whole lot of bipartisanship that occurs. In fact, the vast majority of things that pass Congress pass with the vast majority of members of Congress supporting them. And there's also lack of to the degree that we are more polarized than we have been in the past, which is true to a degree in the sense that the parties have been better at coalescing and unifying within themselves in fighting each other as in the past. There's less of a locked down, for sure, relationship between party polarization and congressional gridlock than people tend to think. We've gone through periods of ebbs and flows of party polarization throughout American history. Gridlock, though, has largely been pretty constant. It's, as Congressman Stewart put it, this is a system that's designed to go slow and oftentimes fail to do things unless you can build really broad support. And then the reality is there's always a lot of issues that Congress is gridlocked on and unable to act on, and then there's always other issues that it can act on. And so to answer your question while making it more confusing, both yes and no, Congress is in some ways more polarized, in some ways it's the same as it always has been, and Congress is sometimes gridlocked and also on many issues not. But the perceptions tend to be worse than reality once again.
Christine, would you say that education policy is an area that matches what Jim just described, or does it feel a little bit different than maybe some issues? Is there something new in the education policy debate landscape, especially at the national level, that has maybe had it actually become more polarized, or at the very least feel more polarized?
So education, I think, does feel more polarized. And to the question of whether or not it's new, it's probably been going on for decades or building for decades. Part of it is this sort of nationalization of education, right? As we discussed, a lot of people for a long time, and many still do, understand education to be a state and local issue. But since around the 1960s, there's really been an uptick in federal intervention in education. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is sort of the framework that has set the terms of the debate ever since in education. It's the vehicle that gets reauthorized every several years, has different names, different agendas, different reforms, but really kind of solidified the federal government's role in education. So making education a national issue can also increase the polarization. If there's this performative aspect that's happening in Congress, then that can bleed into education. And frankly, I think education in general is polarized. And by that, I mean you see at the state level too. I mean, some of these issues are just very controversial no matter where they're being debated. But part of that does come from having it at kind of the party level, right? So something called political sorting, where people will align their views with their parties, right? So if you have party leaders out there explaining what they think about things, then people are learning, okay, this is what a Republican should think about education. This is what a Democrat should think about education. They're kind of taking some cues. So there's also sort of an instructional aspect of being an elected leader that you can also educate people on what they should think or what they will end up thinking.
I wonder if there's a connection to draw between what you both are saying is something the congressman mentioned, but this idea of education becoming more of a nationalized debate in recent decades. And kind of what we talked about, that feeling, that perception at least, that, hey, well, things are more polarized now. At the very least, it feels that way. Could part of it be, number one, if that kind of pushing education up to the national stage is part of that, but then also something the congressman said about in years or decades, eras past, the political polarization that did exist was maybe a little bit more limited to Congress or to elected officials, essentially the political arena. Whereas now, perhaps that has shifted into more and more areas of society, so that in the past, various aspects of daily life did not used to feel political or polarized, but now they do. Is that a phenomenon? I realize that we're getting out a little bit from just your expertise congressionally, but I guess, Jim, do you see that effect at all, that what is there in Congress in terms of conflict, is that starting to pop up more and more in other areas of society?
I think the way that the congressman put it was quite astute when he observed that a lot of issues today have taken on sort of a moral or cultural component, which makes it harder to sort of take a step back and be calm and not be divided over issues. And you see this in the education policy space for sure, where now we have debates over like what types of things should we be teaching in school, what are the basic components of our culture, what should we be saying about race or other issues that are really, really personal and really, really moral. Those are hard things to be less fired up about. Those are hard things to be sort of like staid and in a mood for compromise about, relative to like tax rates, where you can split the difference between someone who prefers a 20% tax rate and someone who prefers a 25% tax rate. The middle's right there. What is the middle ground when people feel that we're talking about morals and cultural issues? And I think that's the kind of thing that is spread to more different policy topics that maybe wasn't the case in the past. It's also maybe been removed from some other policy topics as these things continue to evolve. But that makes it harder to compromise, and it makes it harder for people to not be so inflammatory.
Christine, anything to add to that from specifically the education policy angle? Does that track with what you've seen on that issue and the way it's debated in the public?
Yeah, I mean, I think people identify so strongly with parties sometimes that it becomes part of, even part of identity. And we have so much information coming at us that makes so many issues political, right? And in education, I think sometimes, and this has been discussed before, but it's kind of this zero-sum viewpoint. There's one entity, usually, or for the most part, a public education system, and everybody wants to influence it, and that's a good thing. People want to influence it for the better as they see it. But sometimes it feels like if I win on this issue, you lose, right? And so there's kind of again, that mentality of winner takes all or high stakes.
Jim, I want to ask, kind of shifting back from just the polarization lens to this idea of sort of the structural nature of Congress or the constitutional constraints on Congress. So if someone were making a pitch to someone else saying, okay, education policy might be better served at the state level, and if they gave two reasons, number one, things are really, really polarized in Congress, there's gridlock everywhere, but then number two, if they were to say that, well, again, for the reasons Christine mentioned, constitutionally, if Congress is really not just set up structurally to do these kind of bold, sweeping policy reforms on an issue like this. I'm curious as to your response on both of those arguments. Number one, can we dive in a little more? Is gridlock actually way worse now? And number two, is Congress structurally not the best entity for things like policy education reform or other contentious issues like that?
So I don't think that gridlock is worse now than it was in the past. I think that's something, if you go back, and I've spent some time doing this, if you go back and you read about coverage of Congress, people's commentary on Congress going back decades or even throughout American history, people have been saying since 1790 that Congress is more gridlocked now than it's ever been. And I don't think that's really plausible as a reality. The reality is there's always lots of gridlock. Now, as to the question of like, well, then is it easier to do things in the states, which I think is the implication of what you're asking. Is like, well, if we can't do it at the national level, setting aside for a moment whether or not we should. If we can't, should we do it in the states? Will that be easier? And that's also not so straightforward because 49 of the 50 states are essentially a carbon copy of the federal Constitution in terms of their own policymaking design. Other than Nebraska, which has a single-chambered legislature, every other state has a bicameral legislature with a House and a Senate, sometimes with different names. Every single state has an executive with veto power. These same structural components make it hard to do things at the state level as well. Now, in some states, it may be slightly easier to get policymaking done, in part because those states are more homogenous, like within themselves, than the country is as a whole. So you have fewer disparate opinions, there's less to resolve, there's more homogeneity in terms of what do people want and what do they value and what do they wish for. But in other states, that's not true. Some states are quite diverse and quite large. And so I don't think it's necessarily a blanket solution from we'll be able to get more done at the state and local level. I think just observing politics at the state and local level across the country, you see plenty of gridlock at that level, plenty of conflict on state school boards and local school boards throughout the country, including in this state. And so I don't think that's necessarily like the obvious solution to Congress is unable, so let's do this at the state level. I think sometimes that works, and in some places it works, but it's not sort of a hard and fast, this will solve it.
I want to touch on gridlock one more time, but then get to a question for Christine about what states have been able to do on the education front that might at least give some optimism to that question of, well, should we be pursuing this issue at the state level? But on gridlock, when you say, hey, gridlock is not any worse than it used to be, and again, leading back to that perception, if someone were to say, Jim, come on, like just look at Twitter, look at what's happening in the news, how can you say it's not as gridlocked, or it's as gridlocked as it ever has been? What's a metric by which we in our audience and voters should be evaluating whether Congress is actually more gridlocked or not?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different metrics, which is part of why I think it's less of a compelling case to say like definitely more gridlocked than before. Now, if you look at something like how many laws does Congress pass every 2 years, every congressional session, it would look like we'd get less done because Congress has been passing fewer and fewer laws every year. On the other hand, those laws keep getting bigger. Not in that they're doing more in any one space, but they're passing laws that essentially cobble together lots of different things that in the past would have passed individually. These are called omnibus laws or omnibus packages or legislative packages, whatever term you want to use. Today, Congress passes the same amount in terms of total new pages of laws as it did in the 1980s, and it passes more than it did in the 70s or 60s or 50s or 40s, or you can keep going back in time. In some ways, Congress is doing more now than it ever has done in the past. So those two things cut against each other. And then you have different metrics in terms of like, well, is Congress solving our problems? Which comes down to the authority issue of how do you define our problems? And different people have tried different ways of doing this and come to different conclusions in my world. And then you have questions of like, well, what do the new majority parties want to accomplish? And it turns out that new majority parties more or less succeed on about half of what they wanted and fail on the other half, and that's been true forever. And so like really it's just kind of a muddled mess, which leads me to conclude, trying to take this all in, it's like, well, there's always a lot of gridlock. It probably fluctuates a bit over time, year to year, but hasn't been any sort of clear trend that's left us in a position now where it's like, Congress gets nothing done. People have always believed Congress gets nothing done.
So just to complete that point, is it fair to say that, to your argument, that gridlock is not fundamentally worse, but it is manifesting in different ways?
Yes.
And so maybe that throughout a given year, throughout a given term, if members of Congress, if you look at the calendar, they are fighting and not passing laws for longer stretches throughout the year, but then at certain junctures, they think, oh man, we got to cram a bunch of stuff into this omnibus bill. to get it across the finish line. So
Yes.
it's kind of fits and starts.
Yes, and that's kind of why it looks worse, because if you watched Congress day to day, and in fact, this is how our media covers Congress, they cover it on a beat model, which means you get a new article about Congress every single day. Well, in the past, that made Congress look more productive because it would pass more smaller things on a more regular basis. And so you're like, oh, every couple of weeks, a new bill, a new law, something important has been done. Way to go, Congress, though people always hated Congress. Now it's sort of like there's a lot going on behind the scenes all the time. There's constant negotiations, there's constant like public-facing fighting, all building towards like the passing of the next big omnibus package, which usually happens towards the end of the year, and then it's thousands and thousands of pages it's long, and includes all sorts of things that in the past would have passed in more like sputtered ways. So yes, that makes it appear as though nothing ever gets done, and there's this one moment of success, which gets covered for about 2 days, and about half the stuff in it never gets any recognition. Which, the way I put this to people is Congress has a massive public relations problem that no one knows how to solve.
So let's draw a connection between that and some specific policy wins, or if they aren't wins. And Christine, can you kind of give maybe not necessarily a rebuttal per se, but a perspective to give some context around if Congress, even when they do act in a way that passes legislation in the education policy space, some examples of where, maybe they overcame polarization, maybe they passed legislation that got across the finish line, but what examples are there at the federal level where they did that? They were productive, so to speak, but the outcome actually wasn't maybe the best thing from an education policy standpoint. And, to compare with, what are some policy wins at the state level, in your view, where you would say that this is a good example of how states, whether it's because they're better equipped structurally or for whatever reason they just do pass legislation that maybe is more aligned with their state populations. Kind of give us that comparison to paint a picture of how you would argue that Congress should reflect on its history in education policy to inform what it does now, and where states have been doing a good job.
Yeah, so just to kind of put a finer point on something that we've discussed is that polarization exists at the state level, gridlock can exist at the state level, but neither of those are rationales for why education policy should belong with the states or not in Congress, right? There's just a general principle that the closer you get to the issue, generally speaking, the better, practically speaking, the policy can be. And especially with something like education, where it's this really kind of human-centric, very often one-on-one interaction of teaching and learning. So, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in having states look at it. But in general, No Child Left Behind is a really good case study of this, right? You did have bipartisan support. There was movement, maybe some excitement about it, but in implementation, it was really tough and became very controversial because it dealt with this minutia that states and local districts were so used to handling and very often did just fine. So it was this push to have more rigorous standards. Some states already had standards that were rigorous, like Massachusetts, to require testing more frequently. To have highly qualified teachers, which usually meant that you had a bachelor's degree and expertise in the area, to have them equally allotted in poor, wealthy schools. And then the sanctions were even potentially worse. So if you weren't meeting these metrics, then you had to offer open enrollment transfers from low-performing school to high-performing schools. But without really looking at what did the states have on the books. Did they have open enrollment? Was that actually feasible? Sometimes there was a reluctance to even accept students from low-performing schools. I mean, kind of that human element to it. The turnaround strategies could be very invasive, which was turning a school into a charter school or shutting it down altogether. All of that created a lot of resentment. Some of it just simply didn't work. Some of it politicized education policies that otherwise could have been found on their own or worked at the state level. And I think on the whole, and this isn't even like a left or right of the spectrum, the self-reflection on No Child Left Behind was that it didn't work, right? It was generally considered a failure. I think if there's anything that's come out of it, it's there has been some positives about having a kind of a microscope of accountability, especially for certain subgroups, saying who were we forgetting, how are they really doing? et cetera. So, and even from there, even though there was some self-reflection that it didn't work, they've never really been able to pull back very much of that kind of accountability structure. At the same time, states have been able to do some bolder reforms that reflected what they needed in their state. So, even just recently, Utah passed the Utah Fits All Scholarship. But that was a compromise to also increase teacher salaries. Controversial, certainly, some people thought it was an odd fit. But Utah does have this reputation for looking at the different groups, sometimes that are at odds with each other, and saying, how can we find something that could benefit both of you? That's harder to do at a very specific regional level, accounting for everybody's values in Congress, but it's something that was able to get done at the state level. Another example that comes to mind is the standards, as I mentioned. Massachusetts, well before Common Core was ever a discussion, was known for having really rigorous academic standards, and they created that on their own. They saw, student outcomes that were increasing. They were looked to as sort of a model, right? And even before Common Core, that was sort of the discussion of how could we create something like that. Well, then the Obama administration decided, hey, we do need to strengthen standards. There was this competitive grant program called Race to the Top. And they said, hey, if you adopt certain policies, you can get some funding. This was during the Great Recession, so it was very persuasive. The federal government did not create the Common Core standards, right? So there were these private organizations that got together, but the federal government did incentivize it. And that politicized it to a point that made it just enormously unpopular. A lot of states wound up repealing it or softening them, whatever it may be. But you can see how different the implementation was. When a state wanted to move forward, they were able to do that. When the federal government wanted to impact 50 different states, it was not able to do that, at least not in the long run, and without a lot of blowback. And there's even been some research suggesting that when Massachusetts adopted Common Core to get those funds, that they lowered their standards and the outcomes suffered in their state. So in general, practically speaking, the federal government is not the best level of government to impact changes for student learning.
It sounds like there could be an important takeaway between if Congress gets involved, maybe to try to tease out a couple kind of core principles for folks. Number one, and the congressman mentioned with the work that they had done in a bipartisan way on suicide prevention, strong bipartisan support, one of those issues that's kind of a rallying cry that there's a lot of support for, still took 5 years to get some important things across the finish line. But in the context of when Congress can focus on a little bit more of maybe these big picture, where there's more consensus kinds of issues, and then getting into the really specific weeds of a given issue, leave that to the states. Does that sound like a decent framing? Jim, from your perspective, say Congress focus on this, and Christine, if you were to say, and then let states do this.
I think it probably depends on the issue. I think Christine is right in general that some issues can be better handled at a local or a state or a federal level, and some in different portions of that. Like the difficulty of our federal system is that it's a federal system where the divisions, practically speaking, between what the national government does, what state governments do, and what local governments do is never crystal clear, even if maybe it should be. It never is, and I think that sort of arrangement tends to work better in some cases than in others, and I think education is a great example where this arrangement of having these multiple entities all trying to go at it at once has I think it's clear, not gone great for the last, especially the last 20 or 30 years.
So as we start to wrap up, and I think we'll have time for a couple questions from the audience, so if there's anything that's been on your mind during this discussion that you want to ask either Jim or Christine, and we'll have someone come bring a microphone to you. So be thinking of some juicy questions to toss out. But I want to ask, and this is going back to, again, something the Congressman said, this idea of when we watch gridlock, and if we accept the premise that it's about as good or bad as it's been. It's constant. It's just normal. Mm-hmm. It's part of the institution. Is the argument that, well, that was actually kind of baked into the cake from the beginning. It was supposed to be sort of a slow-moving entity. Is that accurate in your mind, and is that a good thing? Convince all of us that rather than being frustrated that something isn't moving quickly through Congress, we should be glad, because that's the way it's designed to work, and Why is that a good thing for the country?
Yes. Congress, something anyone who's taken a class with me has heard, especially a class on Congress has heard, is that Congress works exactly how it's designed, which is to be very slow. Washington works exactly how it's designed, which is to be extremely slow and not engage in sort of radical, big, bold change. That's the nature of the constitutional system. It's actually what the founders were hoping for, and they actually did a better job than they ever could have imagined, because as the system is continuing to evolve, rather than becoming more streamlined, it's become more convoluted and complex and even harder to accomplish things. I tend to put this big sort of like flow chart up on the screen when I'm teaching this to students that shows our system, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is how you do anything. And then I compare that to sort of a European like parliamentary system where it's just like there's like one arrow from like Parliament says yes, and you have a law. But that was on purpose. Now, whether or not you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. If you're somebody who wants our society to be radically transformed, you're probably unhappy about it. If you want a society where you have to have really broad buy-in before any policies get put into place, which gives them legitimacy and sort of tends to temper down like the prospects of political violence, especially in a country like this, which is really big and really diverse and really broad, then there's a value there. But like I tend to sort of, I teach it as sort of like, it's how it is. Now, whether or not you like it is sort of up to you.
Christine, how would you frame that?
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
So we're talking about this concept of gridlock actually being a feature rather than a bug. And if Congress is designed to be slow moving, would you say that's great? It's a good thing for the national level for these kinds of ideas to not be able to rush through quickly. Would you say yes to that? And then would you say, and therefore here's why states are maybe better suited? Or would you add any layers to that would be relevant to our audience?
Well, I think you don't want laws changing quickly all the time, because then people are confused about what the requirements are, or what's illegal and things like that. So as a just really broad principle, I think slower moving lawmaking is probably a good thing. And even at the state level, I mean, you want some time for deliberation and compromise to make sure that you are creating a law that reflects the values of your state. I mean, gridlock, sometimes I feel like people talk about as if, nothing can get done. I don't think the idea is to technically make lawmaking impossible, right? It's like the amendment process to the Constitution. It's intentionally a high threshold, but it's not technically impossible because you do want that option, right? So you want to get things done at some point. And I think education, where sometimes you do want to respond a little bit more quickly, like to the pandemic, for instance. Sometimes there are decisions that needed to be made pretty quickly, and I think you want an institution that could maybe respond a little faster, and that could happen better with districts or a state legislature.
So final question for you two before we open it up to the room for any questions for our panelists. If Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer and Kevin McCarthy, let's start with you, Jim, they walk into your office and they say, Professor Curry, tell us what to do. We will do whatever you say to help improve things at the federal level to make Congress be better or more productive or do the right things. You've got 10 seconds with those three people in your office. What do you say?
I don't have a clear answer for them. And I think that's like part of me as sort of like the resident sort of Washington congressional optimist. And I think the design is pretty sound. There's the really small things at the margin. Congress should have more staff. It slashed too much of its staff in the 1990s in an effort to sort of like be more of a citizen legislature, and I think that was a mistake. It would give Congress more of its sort of own in-house expertise, which could help it do even better job sort of developing policy proposals and passing laws. But I wouldn't want them to mess with too much. I think it's always easy to be dissatisfied with the status quo and believe that the grass is greener on the other side, but changing things can often have unintended consequences. And me personally, I'd rather have this kind of system where you have to be very deliberate and you have to build really broad support in order to do anything than the reverse. So that's probably a dissatisfactory answer, but that's more or less what I believe.
No, it's excellent. Christine, same question. That group of leaders says, hey, what do we do?
Focus on issues where there is delegation to the federal government, or there's a federal nexus. If you want to talk about education, as obviously we have today, it's not to say Congress has no role whatsoever. Congress does actually make legislation for the DC area, right? So that's a direct role that they can play. The Bureau of Indian Schools, there's been sort of this understanding that they have a role to play in equal access, making sure that different groups have access to education. And so I would say make sure that you're focusing on those things and then leave everything else to the states.
Thank you both. Okay, we got a couple minutes for some questions from the audience. Go ahead and raise your hand. Let's start with this gentleman back here.
Hi, so I wanted to ask a question on age in Congress, because I think a lot of young people are worried about how old Congress is, especially with Mitch McConnell's most recent interview mishap. So my question is, does it worry you with some of the ages of congressional members, and how realistic do you think it is to see sort of checks on that, whether that is like term limits or age limits going into play in Congress?
I'll stick with my theme in saying that I'm not concerned at all. Congress has always been old. It's older now because people live longer, is part of the story. It's not perfect. It would be somewhat ideal if you had a bit more of an better age distribution in Congress. Though Congress, it's interesting, you're getting a lot of stories about this right now, and I think it's just because some very highly visible members of Congress are quite old, but Congress has actually gotten younger over the last 5 or 6 years, because there's usually it's this sort of like ebb and flow over time. But I would never want to do like the two things you would have to do to change that, and that you could practically do to change it. There's a lot you could do more societally to like try to like get younger people involved, but like the things that you could do practically to change it tomorrow are what you suggested, term limits or age limits. And we know that term limits are a terrible idea because we've tried it in various states. There's a reason why various states undid it, is because it actually made all the problems that they were meant to solve worse. It actually made legislators more beholden to special interests, less responsive to constituents, empowered bureaucrats. All the things that they thought term limits would actually solve, it made them worse. And I wouldn't want to install age limits either, in part because over American history, some of our most talented legislators have been quite advanced in age. There is something to be said for the expertise and the wisdom you gain about how to get things done in Washington. And so, you know, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, I think you have to recognize that Nancy Pelosi was quite effective as a Speaker of the House, quite effective as a legislator. From an objective standpoint, whether you like the things she stood for or not, she was really good at the job, and it's something she got better at every passing year into her 80s. And so you have to ask yourself, do you want to sacrifice that level of expertise and knowledge on how to do things in this complex environment just because of age? Now, I think there are other things you can do, not to stick on this too long, but part of the reason why Congress is so old is because people tend to not embark on political careers until they are already older, especially women, where it's hard to be like, I'm going to run for office while you have little children at home. Which means oftentimes people first start on their political careers when they're in their late 40s or 50s, which means by the time they get to Congress, they're in their late 50s or 60s, and by the time they gain power in Congress, they're in their 70s. Now, maybe there's ways we can make it easier for people to get engaged in politics at an earlier age, which means it doesn't have to take so long. But that's sort of a longer-term solution rather than a, let's fix this tomorrow.
Christine, anything you want to add to the question of age in Congress?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't put a lot of thought into it, but it does seem like age is a little bit more arbitrary than maybe violations of the office or, you know, being incapable of actually serving. So I would be reluctant to focus on age.
Other questions from, let's go right here in the blue.
Talking about the gridlock and how slow things move, seems to me over the last 3 years that we had executive branch and public health legislating, passing laws, taking away people's liberties, doing things that which should move slow and didn't move slow under the guise of public health. And so I'm just wondering what you see from a congressional level, what they can do to like rein in executive orders, legislating from the bench, things that the other branches of government aren't supposed to do, but sometimes they do because they do. There are people who do think it moves too slow. So I think we saw some real harm done by people trying to ram things through.
Yeah. So I'd say, like, yeah, if like to your point, like the fastest way to have a government do stuff is to have it done without legislative approval, which is, I think, also I agree, is not ideal. Now, I would say this, like, other than like the COVID pandemic aside, which saw like a massive shift of authority to the executive branch, both at the federal level and at the state levels temporarily, we've actually seen Congress claw back a lot of its power over the last 10, 15 years, and that presidents haven't done as much on an executive level and been successful at it as they had been during, say, the Nixon years, the Reagan years, or the Clinton years, where you could really be concerned about like how frequently and on how many issues you had aggressive policymaking from the executive branch. Congress has sort of like reined that in a bit and used more of its tools. And so I think then if that's a concern, that's what you want to see, is you want to see Congress continue to examine what's being done in a unilateral way at the executive level as well as at the judicial level, and continue to take steps to build its own capacity to do these things on its own. And hopefully that has been a trend that's sort of been underlying things lately, really since sort of maybe the middle of the Obama administration, and I hope that continues.
We have just a couple minutes left, so let's try and do fast questions and short answers, almost like a lightning round, so we can try and get everyone in. Let's go right here in the black, and then gentleman with the computer back there.
Perfect, thank you. So my question is, it seems like, and I'm not sure if it's been rising as much as it seems like, and there's some research to back this up, but there appears to be a difference in influence that's wielded by varying levels of wealth. So rich people are able to make more donations. They make a greater representation in think tanks and universities and government bodies. It seems like people who have less money have less influence as far as, at least financially. And so is it true that people with more wealth have more influence, have more power in the political sphere? And if so, is that correct? Is that a good thing?
It's true, but probably in a more nuanced way than people tend to expect. I think people view money and they're like, rich people can just like buy whatever policies they want. Really, it's more nuanced in that people who spend a lot of money in politics can play gatekeeping roles in terms of who runs for office and advances and gets there. Not in every case, but in some cases. If you have lots of money behind you, it's easier to make your way through. If you have less money behind you, it's harder to get through the various steps of being a candidate and getting elected. Now, there's less evidence that money makes much of a difference in a direct sense on when policies are being made. But if it shapes who gets into office in the first place, there's sort of an indirect effect there, right? Now, is that good or bad? I guess I'll do what I always do and say, I guess, in the eye of the beholder. If you want, like, interests with more money to have more influence, then I guess it's good. If you don't, then it's probably not ideal. But it's one of the many issues that's probably going to be difficult for us to ever solve.
Christine, I wonder if there's a layer to add to that as far as what have you seen in the education policy space? Does it feel like it's influenced by maybe financial interests or things, or does it feel more like it's really driven by kind of just the meat and potatoes of the issues that are being discussed? Any kind of rough sense there?
I mean, I think money usually results in some sort of influence. I mean, whether or not you're able to run for office or have a corporation that somehow gets involved or something like that. I would say that that's probably the case also in education. Whether it's a good thing, my sense is that it's probably not, right? There's so many different interests that you want to bring together and to look at to make good policy that affects everyone. So that would be my response.
Thank you. Was there a hand over here, right? Yeah.
I was just wondering, for Professor Curry, how, with the polarization that we see in terms of education nowadays, how Congress can effectively backpedal that to explain to the public more effectively that perhaps there is a more common consensus that we should be taking on. And I'd also like to ask, in terms of top-down politics, from a federal level, what can the federal government do to allow for states to have more say in shaping education as it pertains to the specific area that they are representing?
I'll answer the first one and leave the second one for you. That's really hard because Congress plays a major role in why people think it's so polarized, because it constantly tells us that they are. Because they see, each side sees it in their political interest to sort of play up unity and this is what we stand for on our side and knock down the other side and say these people are bad. Because they believe that helps them win elections. Now, whether or not that's true is sort of beside the point, but they believe it. So members of Congress would have to sort of set aside their sort of electoral incentives and be like, no, like, they're not so bad. Here are the kinds of things you actually just heard from Congressman Stewart today, where he's like, you know, like, oh, there's a lot of performative aspect. It's rare that you get members of Congress who will say that in a public forum, and you could say like, well, maybe Congressman Stewart's willing to say that because he's retiring, but I've heard him say that before in my classes. So he's always been pretty honest about that, which is nice and refreshing. But very few of them will say that. It's sort of like black and white. It's us versus them, because they believe that serves their electoral interests. So you would need to find a way to get them to not work in their interests, which is hard. But that would do it. If you could get Congress to stop saying that the other side is so bad, that we're so polarized, just pointing that out all the time, like, it would probably slowly shape the perceptions, but I wouldn't hold your breath.
Yeah, to the second question, that's a really good question that we've discussed a lot, because if you have an elected member who believes that power needs to go back to the states, is their only option inaction then? I think the answer is that if there's an existing policy, they can do things to free up federal funds, make it more flexible, turn it into scholarships where parents are the decision makers about how to use that, whether that's Title I funds or that's just an example. But in general, to look at existing policies and to turn it back to flexibility and creativity of the states.
So we're at time. I wanted to make sure no one on this side had a burning question. We're kind of weighted to this side of the room, which is okay. If you can be brief and efficient, we'll have this be our last question from the audience.
I just wanted to touch on the comments about how it's like time length, like Congress takes a really long time to get out legislation, but it kind of just seems like more so that it's a lack of responsiveness to popular policy. So I guess, is it that Congress just takes too long to get policy out, or is it that they're not responsive to popular issues?
I'd say they're quite responsive. Members of Congress, in fact, are obsessed with trying to do things that are popular, but they are obsessed with doing it within the people in their particular districts. That's really the key. No one in Congress represents the entire country. Everyone in Congress represents a tiny slice of it, which means they're all trying to be responsive, like, what do people in the Utah 2nd District want? What do people in Wyoming want? What do people in New York's 15th District want? And those are all very, 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 very different things. And no one is really considering sort of the broader, like, what's the national interest? But that's how Congress is designed. So you have 535 like highly responsive people who are being responsive to really specific pockets of the country that often do not reflect the country as a whole, in fact, rarely do, such that it appears that no one is being responsive because no one is being responsive at the national level, which then means it takes a long time for them to coalesce behind solutions that might serve some sort of national interest. But even then, the resultant legislation tends to more so serve each local interest and may not work ideally at a national level. So I don't know if that answers your question, but this is paradox where members of Congress can be highly responsive to their voters and not responsive nationally at all.
Christine, responsive on education?
That's great.
Excellent. Well, Christine and Jim, we want to thank you both so much for having this discussion today, and thank all of you for coming. That will about wrap things up. I want to mention that on the screens here we have a QR code for a very, very brief survey. We'd love all of your feedback on the content, the format. Would love to hear from you there. So thank you again for being part of this 2023 Sutherland Congressional Series, and thanks to the U and the Hinckley Institute for partnering together with this excellent venue. Nick, is there anything else we need from you or from anyone else?
No, I don't think so. Please keep an eye out on the Hinckley Institute's calendar as well as the Sutherland calendar for upcoming Congressional Series events. We have other members of the Congressional delegation coming to the University of Utah for conversations in the coming weeks. But thank you all for coming, and thank you again to Sutherland for being a great partner.